It's just getting to start. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks for coming. My name is Joe Green. This presentation is MLK and RFK 50 years later, and it's based on a zine that I recently did for Microcosm Publishing, and I'll talk about that as we go. This is not really a PowerPoint presentation. These are just some images that I put together, but mostly it's just going to be me talking. We'll go through a few of these very quickly. Does that do, what is forward? I don't know what forward is. I don't know what I'm doing, so just bear with me. So my website is joegreenjfk.com. Those are some of the books. Those on the left are ones that I've written. Judge for Yourself is a treasury by John Judge, who is my mentor. And my wife and I have a publishing company called Say Something Real Press. And we put out John's book, and then my wife's book, Dr. Faith Harper, has The Revolution Will Include Cookies. That's one of the books that we put out.
That's a great title.
It's a good title, isn't it? I think that was mine. Was that mine?
No, don't steal.
So John Judge is probably the reason that I'm here. And I'll just tell the story very quickly. John Judge was a researcher and political activist and peace activist for about half a century in Washington, D.C. And he had a conference every year in Dallas in November. And I had read an article by him called The Black Hole of Guyana that appeared in a book called Secret and Suppressed. And I was so blown away by this article, which I'm not going to go into the details right now because it's a whole other story, that I decided I would go down and meet him. So I drove down to Dallas. I had breakfast with John for 3 hours, and that was it for me. So I was part of John Judge's crew. And he was part of the Coalition on Political Assassinations. This was back in '06. And so I helped him out with various conferences over the years until his untimely death in 2014, in February. And so we put out that book to collect some of his writings, which are amazing. And it's extraordinary. When John died, the Washington Post gave him a full-page obituary, and it was very nice. And they had never written a good word about him in the whole time that he was alive. So there you go. But at least they did that. So among other things that I've been involved in, I was involved in a documentary called King Kill 63. And just from top to bottom there, it's my buddy Joe McBride, who is this incredible researcher, but he also wrote Steven Spielberg's biography and Orson Welles' biography. In fact, Netflix is putting out a film next year, the last Orson Welles film. It's called The Other Side of the Wind. And they've spent all this money. There was this recent controversy about whether they're going to show it at Cannes or not, but Netflix has got it. Well, he's in it. And all kinds of other things. He's like pretty much the world's most interesting person. He wrote the Ramones movie, among other things. And then Oliver Stone and the great Dick Gregory, who just died, unfortunately, a couple of months ago. Meeting Dick Gregory was like one of the great events of my life. He was amazing. We interviewed him on camera. And Richard Belzer, who's also in it, also a conspiracy guy. That film debuted at the Dallas International Film Festival in 2015. However, it has not found distribution, and there's all kinds of problems, and I don't know whether anybody's ever going to see it. But anyway, it's out there, and hopefully one of these days. Joe McBride, I think, finished shooting The Other Side of the Wind, God, like it must have been the early 70s. I'm not exactly sure. And he's waited like 40-something years to see his film. So hopefully I won't have to wait this long, but we'll see. These are just some radio shows that I've done over the years, Black Op Radio, and the last one I did was with Midnight Rider News, which I was very happy with. The Ocelli Effect, Black Op Radio. Tessa Dick, who was actually, if you're into science fiction, she was married to Philip K. Dick at the end of his life. Very interesting woman, and she has a show. And then Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis, which is a nationally syndicated program. I've been on that a couple times. Just stuff that I've been on. And these are the zines that I've done recently for Microcosm Publishing, the JFK assassination, and then the latest one is about the MLK and RFK assassinations. So those are out there. And this was just something I thought was interesting. Time Life magazine just put out this this thing here. I didn't do the red button on this thing.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Okay, yeah. So these are 4 assassins on their cover. And so we got Lee Harvey Oswald, we have James Irwin, we have Sirhan Bashar Sirhan, and we have Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon. I'm positive 3 of those people are not assassins. Mark David Chapman, I'm pretty sure, was not the assassin. But I don't have the same kind. It's more of a circumstantial case. That's an interesting case. But I just think it's interesting that we can do that. History is such that there is a magazine, and it's not surprising that it's Time Life, because Time Life has been in bed with these guys for a long, long time. But the fact is, the matter is, you can put 4 people on a cover, and none of those people are likely to have been the assassins in this case. And just to kind of take off from that, I have a slide here. As a matter of fact, let's start up. Let's go ahead and do it in the order that I was going to skip around, but I won't. So I'm going to talk about conspiracies just for a second, because conspiracies are kind of a scare word for people. You know, when you say conspiracy, it's like, oh God, you know, aliens or, you know, whatever.
Tinfoil hats.
Tinfoil hats, yeah. Please note that there is nothing special about the term conspiracy theory. Either a conspiracy theory is true or isn't, but it's not a special kind of claim, right? Prosecutors don't say, okay guys, that what I'm about to say is a conspiracy theory, right? I think these 2 guys got together to rob this liquor store, right? Like, prosecutors do conspiracies every day, because conspiracies happen every day. It's a natural part of, you know, it's like the Federal Reserve, right? How many people get to vote on what happens with the Federal Reserve? About a dozen. Is that a conspiracy? Kind of. I mean, not a lot of people get a vote on it, right? So, the type of conspiracy theories that I'm talking about, however, are not rooted in, you know, 6 lizard men rule the world, or aliens, or whatever the hell that stuff is. But the sort of natural conspiracies in which people of power occasionally ally themselves with other people in power, but not all the time. Because that's another important thing, is that it's not monolithic. Anybody who comes and tells you that they can identify the 8 people in the room that run the world is lying, because it doesn't work like that. It's more like how corporations occasionally find themselves on the same side of an issue and occasionally find themselves on opposite sides of an issue. That sort of thing happens. But because corporations have a lot more power than, say, you or I, they occasionally get away with stuff. Right? For example, Pfizer was a company that made artificial hearts, and they did an actuarial study, and because they put out a heart that had a flaw in it. And so they did an actuarial study, and it was cheaper to let people die and get sued than to fix the flaw. Right? So they decided, if you want to put it this way, and I would put it this way, they decided to murder a bunch of people. Right? They didn't know who they were murdering, but they decided to murder them. Those are the kinds of decisions that get made all the time when you have that sort of power. So, the idea behind conspiracy theories is to tag certain truth claims as absurd if they assert that public leaders act like human beings with human desires. In other words, if the husband gets killed, the wife probably did it. But if the president gets killed, the vice president could not have possibly done it, because somehow the interests of the vice president are different from the interests of, you know, wife or husband, whatever. The only difference is that the stakes are much greater. And then, if you're familiar with William Shakespeare's history plays, virtually all of them involve conspiracies. Such is the nature of political power, whether you're talking about kings, Congress, or Parliament. Anything that involves factions. Any hierarchy produces conspiracies. The television program Survivor is about conspiracies, right? People decide, I'm gonna go with you, and we're gonna do this, and we're gonna undermine them because we want to achieve power. Well, it's a natural way that human beings behave. Humans are social beings who look for allies in an attempt to bring wealth, power, or social favor for themselves. Okay? So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that everything's a conspiracy, because everything isn't a conspiracy. But if you have evidence that there is, then you shouldn't ignore it on the basis of some idea that, oh, I don't believe in conspiracies. So, we're going to talk about the 1960s, right? What are often called the four major assassinations of the 60s. John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Bobby Kennedy, right? Kennedy, the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King were killed by quote-unquote lone nut assassins. Malcolm X was killed by a team of assassins, although actually there is a man who killed Malcolm X, because the guy with the shotgun who shot Malcolm X did kill him. And then there was two other guys who came and shot him with pistols, but he was already dead. And incidentally, the guy who shot Malcolm X is alive, never went to jail for that crime, and I think he lives in Baltimore. I'm not going to say his name. But, so these four assassinations are not the only major assassinations in the 60s, I would say, and we may touch on the other one. But these clearly had an enormous political effect on the world. Okay? And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit with Dr. King and with Bobby. But before we go there, I got one more, and this slide doesn't work too well, and I apologize. But what I've listed here is from 1963 to 1982, these are the attempted political assassinations of leaders. Some of them successful, some of them not. Okay? And they're interesting. Okay? So, for example, the first one on this list here is George Wallace in May of 1972. He was shot by a guy named Arthur Bremer. All right? George Wallace was a racist, like a hardcore racist. At the beginning, he was in something called the American Independent Party. He eventually became a Democrat. And that's actually part of the story, which we'll get to. But George Wallace emerged as a potential threat to Richard Nixon's 1972 campaign. And he was shot by a lone nut assassin, Arthur Bremer. And there is an incredible, in the Nixon tapes, there's this incredible conversation that happens between Charles Colson and Richard Nixon. Charles Colson calls Nixon and says, hey, you know, this guy Bremer, he shot Wallace. And Nixon says, oh wow, is he a left-winger or a right-winger? And Colson says, I don't know. And Nixon says, well, can we get some left-wing stuff in his apartment? And Colson says, yeah, I think we can do that. And so they're actually talking about planting left-wing literature. And in fact, there was some Black Panther literature that was found in Bremer's apartment. Okay, and this whole thing is really strange. Later, there was a diary that came out, Arthur Bremer's diary. It was published as a book. And Gore Vidal wrote an article for the New York Review of Books where he said, I recognize the guy who wrote that diary, and it's not Arthur Bremer. It's a guy named E. Howard Hunt who works for the CIA. Very interesting. Anyway, we'll pass that on. There's more, but Gerald Ford. Most people do not remember this at all. But there were two attempted assassinations of Gerald Ford in 1975 within 3 weeks of each other. Both of them were women, interestingly enough, and one of them was Squeaky Fromm, who you may remember as one of Charlie Manson's girls. They were both kind of, I want to say, awkward assassinations. In one case, one of the women didn't even have a loaded gun. But they were very strange, and there may be reasons for that too, and we'll get there. Congressman Leo Rice was shot to death on November 1978 by a military-style ambush in Guyana at Jonestown. Leo Ryan was investigating Jonestown. He came down on a plane, and he was machine gunned on the tarmac. 9 days later, Harvey Milk was shot to death by a person that was on his board. And the interesting thing about that, and what most people don't know, is that Harvey Milk also had a connection to Jonestown. There are letters going back and forth between Harvey Milk and Jim Jones, and there was money involved. Again, that's a whole other story, but I'm just putting these out there. Allard Lowenstein. So Allard Lowenstein was a political figure on the left, primarily in the 60s, and he was a big supporter of Bobby Kennedy. And in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention, he was one of the figures that possibly could have been put forward to take over. Because what happened was after King and then Bobby Kennedy got assassinated, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968 was total chaos. It blew up. There was rioting. In fact, there's this great movie. What the heck is it called? I'll think of it. But there's a movie that was made by Haskell Wexler, this famous cinematographer, and he actually shot at the convention. So he's got actors running in between the tear gas and the riot police in this thing. It's nuts. But anyway, that chaos resulted certainly following the death of Bobby Kennedy. And then in 1980, so several years later, a man shot Allard Lowenstein to death, a man who said that he had a transmitter in his teeth that was put in there by the CIA, and that they were telling him to kill Allard Lowenstein. And this was, and I know a lot of folks, I keep correspondence with a lot of people who were around these figures at the time. And it was interesting because they were very resistant to this idea that Allard Lowenstein had worked for the CIA. Unfortunately, there's a really good book by Richard Lowenstein called The Pied Piper that shows pretty conclusively that he was. Now, what that actually meant is a very complicated story. And whether he was really, how do I want to say this? Whether he was really sinister in that regard, you would say, I don't know. But eventually he was murdered in 1980. And then, of course, John Lennon, which I was just talking about with Mark David Chapman. There's several very curious things about that assassination, but they won't become clear until we look at some other stuff. So my main point here, though, is that, and then, of course, you don't see it on the slide, but Reagan. Reagan comes next. He was shot on March 30th, 1981. Again, by a lone nut, John Hinckley, who was a friend of the Bush family. And in fact, his brother was having dinner with Neil Bush the night after the shooting happened. And again, there's a whole other story with this stuff. But this looks crazy. Okay? Like, if you were looking at this from the outside, this looks like what most people think of as Latin American countries, right? A lot of Americans look at Latin American countries as there's continual revolutions and politicians getting killed all the time. And it's true, although we're responsible for a lot of that. But in that 20-year period, it looks like being a politician is pretty dangerous, and getting protection for politicians is not easy, apparently. All right? So, just in this context. So, back to Martin Luther King. The Martin Luther King that has survived, the Martin Luther King that everybody knows now, that is common knowledge to school kids and adults, is I Have a Dream. Right? It's basically the March on Washington in '63. It's a letter from a Birmingham jail. It's peace through resistance. And in fact, Faith just showed me a story yesterday. B. King tweeted something about how Martin Luther King would have supported Colin Kaepernick, and some random guy on the internet said, "No, you're all wrong. You know what the hell you're talking about." And this is his granddaughter.
Daughter.
His daughter. I'm sorry, his daughter. So his daughter doesn't know what it is, and it's very obvious that Colin Kaepernick is using exactly the same methods as Martin Luther King. It is not violent to take a knee. I mean, that's exactly the sort of protest that Martin Luther King did all the time. He would have people that would march. It was non-resistance. I mean, it was resistance, passive resistance. Nothing violent, but you stand there and make a nuisance of yourself. You make yourself seen. You make yourself heard. That's the sort of stuff he did all the time. But one of the things that happened to King is that over the course of time, he had not been talking about the Vietnam War. And so he's got the Poor People's Campaign, he's got all of these things, but in the back of his mind, Vietnam's going on. And Lyndon Johnson, who's takes office after Kennedy's killed, he wants to be supposedly the new Franklin Roosevelt. So he's got his, he wants to supply all these social programs. But the social programs are getting eaten up by the fact that we're in Vietnam. So, this is just kind of an interesting little, I meant to bring this, I actually have this, the Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. And the reason I like this is, I think this is accurate. Like, in some ways, Martin Luther King now is kind of a comic book. Like, he's a representative of goodness. But it reduces him in the fact that he was actually more complex than this, and we'll get there. And, so Showdown for Nonviolence. The types of reportage that went on with King are pretty similar to the vitriol that you hear on Fox News. The Washington Post wrote endless articles about King and what a horrible person he was, et cetera, et cetera. At the time that he was alive and actually working. The press was not kind to Dr. King. And it's amazing now because he's seen in this kind of light that nobody really criticizes him, but when he was alive, the papers were against him all the time. Now, this is what happened as far as Vietnam goes. The gentleman that's pictured next to Martin Luther King, his name is William Pepper. And at the time, in the 60s, he was a photojournalist. And he went to Vietnam and he took these photos for a magazine called Ramparts. Ramparts was a radical leftist magazine. It was a great magazine. It's terrific. And he did these photos, and I have this Children of Vietnam issue, and it's pretty much the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. The photographs in that magazine will scar you. Because they're literally photos of children that have been burned by white phosphorus, and it's unbelievable. Well, King saw the magazine, and he contacted Pepper, and he invited Pepper to speak to his congregation. But that magazine was key in King's eventual decision to talk about Vietnam. And on April 4th, 1967, he gave a speech in which he finally said, I can't be quiet about this anymore. Vietnam is destroying America. It's destroying our soul, is what's happening. And his own people, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they were not happy with him for doing this because he lost a lot of support when he did that. And it's interesting because he gave that speech on April 4th, 1967. He was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. So exactly 1 year from the time that he decided to speak about Vietnam, he was murdered. All right. So what happened? Dr. King had gone to Memphis to support a sanitation worker strike. And he had never experienced actual violence at one of these marches. And this one blew up. And part of the reason it blew up is because there was a gang called the Invaders that modeled themselves on the Black Panthers. And they stirred up this whole big thing. And he was embarrassed by the fact that this happened. And so he was determined to come back to Memphis. Well, the FBI got the local Memphis newspaper to run an article about the fact that when Martin Luther King would come to Memphis, he would stay at the Holiday Inn. And this editorial said, why does he stay at the Holiday Inn with Whitey when he should be staying in a black-owned hotel? So when he came back to Memphis in April of 1968, he stayed at the Lorraine Motel, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum. And I recommend that you go there, I mean, if you get a chance. Because it's interesting. I mean, it's you get a chance to see where the actual building is in reference to where the shooter is supposed to be. And the other interesting thing about it is that, like the 6th floor museum, you cannot get to the actual place where the shooter was. They've got it glassed off. So you can't get to it. You can't look at it. So, probably all of you have seen this photo. It's one of the most famous photos in the world. This is right after Martin Luther King was shot through the throat. And I don't know if I have my little laser thing here. There we go. But that's him there lying down. He's just been shot. And there's a guy, if you could make him out, sitting right above him, right? You see this guy right there? Sitting there. That guy's name is Merrill McCullough. Okay? At the time, Merrill McCullough was a member of the Invaders, the gang. Except it turned out later that Merrill McCullough was an FBI informant who had infiltrated the Invaders and who actually got a bunch of them busted. Then, about 20 years later, do I have that right? It was in the 80s. It was on a show, it was Nightline, or I may have that. Back in the day, when people watched news shows, they would have late night shows at about 10 o'clock. Nightline 2020, and I'm not sure which one it was, but it was Sam Donaldson. Okay. And Sam Donaldson gets a report that Merrill McCullough works for the CIA. And so he calls the CIA. He asks to speak with Merrill McCullough. They put him through. And he says, are you the guy are you the guy in the photo? And he says, yeah, I'm the guy in the photo. He said, how long have you been working for the CIA? He says, 17 years. Really? Now, the context of that is that there was a trial going on, a civil trial, that had been, in the interim, this period, William Pepper was a lawyer, and he became James Earl Ray's lawyer. And he initiated a civil trial against a man named Lloyd Jowers. So we'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to show you one more thing here. Okay. This is a sketch of the MLK assassination. I know it's going to be really hard for you guys to see this. I realize that. It's tiny. And this drawing, by the way, was done by a guy named Robert Cutler, who's a brilliant researcher that not a lot of people know about. And he did these kind of graphics. But it just kind of shows you the boarding house and where MLK was standing there on the Lorraine Hotel. Now, originally, MLK had a room that was on the other side of Lorraine Hotel. So it would have been very difficult to get a shot. Somebody in MLK's camp moved the room. We don't know who that is, although there's certainly suspicions. Somebody got him a room up on the balcony where it would be an easy shot. Now, okay. So this is a recreation of what would have had to happen for the shooter, James Earl Ray, to have shot MLK from Bessie's boarding house. Now, Bessie's boarding house was a dump, okay? And there was only, the individual rooms did not have bathrooms. There was a communal bathroom in this place, okay? And it was filled with alcoholics and, I'm sure drug abusers and that sort of thing. Well, the bathtub was up against the wall so that any shooter actually had to stand not in the bathtub, but literally on the bathtub to make the shot. Okay? Anyway, I think that photo's so striking. And of course, you can't recreate that now because they've pulled the bathroom away from the wall. If you go to the National Civil Rights Museum, they've set it up differently, so you can't see how it originally was. It's very interesting in itself. Anyway, So James Earl Ray is supposed to be the alleged assassin of Martin Luther King. And James Earl Ray is a petty crook, basically. And he came from a family of crooks. His dad was like a swindler, and his brother, I met his brother, Jerry Ray. He wrote a book with a friend of mine, a really entertaining book, actually, about their life. And he was not, however, a violent criminal. He was not a psychopath. He was a petty thief. That's what he was. And he was set up for this crime. And there are many things that point to him being set up for this crime. One of the unusual things that happened, okay, after he took this shot, which, first of all, remember, it's in a communal bathroom. You know, there's going to be people banging on the door, because the guy, he doesn't know when Dr. King's going to come out of the room, right? So he's just got to sit there waiting with his gun sticking out of this bathroom window to supposedly shoot King. But as soon as he does, he runs downstairs and he runs in front of a store called Kniep's. It was run by this guy named Guy Kniep. And what he does is he throws the rifle on the ground. He throws his underwear on the ground. He throws his prison radio on the ground. All this incriminating stuff he throws on the ground in front of the store. And then he runs and escapes. As one would, right? And there's another problem, which is that Guy Kniep, the owner of the store, said that somebody threw that junk there 10 minutes before the shot happened. So there's a lot of problems with this. Okay. So then James Earl Ray escapes. He disappears for months. He starts taking flights to Europe. He also gets into Canada. And then something very unusual that a researcher named Phil Melanson found, which is that when he went to Canada, James Earl Ray somehow found 4 different fake IDs. And all of the people in the fake IDs looked like him and were roughly his age in 1968. Like, how the hell did he do this? And he had this shadowy contact, this guy named Raoul, that was giving him money and telling him things to do. Anyway, James Earl Ray was finally captured by Scotland Yard. Where he's getting the money to do all of this traveling, nobody knows. And the FBI has turned itself into knots, saying that he was doing various crimes, which he could not have done, in order to supply the money for all this stuff. Well, he's the most wanted man, in the United States at this time. Anyway, he comes back in. Pepper becomes his lawyer. There's a lot of other stuff that happens, which is crazy, which I can't get into because the original trial of James Earl Ray is so crazy. He has first he has a lawyer that's assigned to him, and then a guy from Texas who was a very famous lawyer at the time named Percy Foreman flies in and says, James Earl Ray, you should hire me. I'm going to take over your case, and I can get you off. And he told Jerry Ray that too. He said, yeah, I can get your brother off, no problem. And as soon as James Earl Ray decided to do that, Percy Foreman said, now you're going to have to plead guilty. It's the only way to avoid the electric chair. Okay? And it's funny because in the hearing where James Earl Ray was pleading guilty, he stood up and he said, I'm fine with everything you guys are saying, but I just want to make it known that I don't agree with the theories of Mr. Hoover. In other words, I don't agree with the fact that I'm pleading guilty, but I pleaded guilty. And in fact, the next day, he immediately wrote the judge and said, yeah, I made a mistake. I don't want to plead guilty in this case. Well, that judge, his name was Judge Battle. And when he got the petition, and Judge Battle was he was looking at it, decided, he died of a heart attack. Literally, with the piece of paper on his desk. Bizarre stuff that happened in this case, let me tell you. Anyway, many years later, Pepper became his lawyer, instituted a civil suit against a guy named Lloyd Jowers. Lloyd Jowers owned a restaurant on the other side, and Jowers had said that he had given a weapon to another person to do the shooting. Anyway, that trial took place, and James Roy was found not guilty in the civil trial, and the King family participated. Dexter King met with James Irwin, talked to him, and Dexter said, I believe you. I think that you are telling the truth when you say you did not kill my father. And so when the King family sued, they sued for $1. The civil court that heard the case came to the conclusion that Jowers was 30% responsible for the assassination and 70% belonged to other parties that were unknown, but not James Irwin. And the interesting thing about that story is that almost nobody has heard of this. Almost nobody knows that in the last trial of James Irwin, that he was found not guilty. It was a civil trial, so you have to make that clear, not a criminal trial. Which is interesting because when the House Select Committee assassination started in 1976, most people don't know this either, but the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was a congressional investigation, they found that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a conspiracy. And it's actually in their records. They say it looks like a probable conspiracy. That's a whole other story. But again, most people do not know this. Whenever people talk about the Kennedy assassination, they go back to the Warren Commission. They don't go back to the House Select Committee, even though that was several years later. So, yeah, it is bizarre. And this is just some of the really good books that I think are on the case. A lot of them are by William Pepper, who is now the lawyer for Sirhan and Sirhan. And he's actually a barrister in England. Very, very interesting man. I got to meet him in 2008, I think. But an interesting guy, long history. And then there's a book by Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, Murder in Memphis. Very interesting book by my friend Lyndon Barston, Truth at Last. It's funny, I kind of hesitate. How are we doing on time? What's happening? Anybody have the time? I didn't want to. 7:42. 7:42. Yeah, geez, that's the problem. So anytime I go on these little sideways, which are so fascinating, but I take up more time, and I want to get to Bobby. So when Martin Luther King was killed, Bobby had just landed. I think he was in Detroit, and there was a group of people there to meet him at the plane. It was fairly late at night, and he had heard that King had been shot, but most of the crowd hadn't. So on April 4th of that year, Bobby Kennedy was the one who told him that Martin Luther King was shot, and he said something really interesting. He says, Martin Luther King has been shot. It's apparently he's deceased, and it appears that it was a white man that shot him. And then he says, and I know something about this because one of my family members was also shot by a white man. Wow. No, that's quite statement. And the interesting thing about Bobby Kennedy is that he undergoes a real change, because when he was the Attorney General and he was in the White House with his brother, he was a hard ass. He was the guy who got things done. Jack would tell his brother, I need this and that and this other thing, and Bobby would go do it. Hoover put a tail on him to find out because Hoover put a tail on everybody to find out what they were doing. And the FBI agent says, this guy, all he does is work. He goes to work, he goes home, he sleeps, he gets up in the morning, he goes and works. Like, he doesn't have hookers, he's got, I got nothing. So Hoover's guys weren't able to pin anything on Bobby because of that. But at a certain point, and I don't know when exactly that point was, but his attitude changed. Obviously, the fallout from his brother's assassination. But he started to work with Cesar Chavez, which people know about. And he also, the Washington Post ran this really interesting story the other day, just last week, why Robert Kennedy went to Pine Ridge. And Pine Ridge is the Indian reservation. And his people did not want him to make this visit. They thought, what the hell are you going to an Indian reservation for? Like, what's the point of that? And he told them. And it's a great book. Kennedy's advisors crowded him with reasons not to go. One aide, Fred Dutton, was adamant. I told him we're in a campaign and he should knock off the engines. He wrote me back a note, which I kept. It's in longhand on yellow paper. He wrote, those of you who think you're running my campaign don't love Indians the way I do. You're a bunch of bastards. That's Bobby Kennedy. Like, that's expressed in a very Bobby Kennedy way. And I think that whether Bobby Kennedy was actually going to win in 1968 has been highly contested. It would have been really difficult for him to do, even though he had just won the LA primary. But it was pretty long odds, and actually, you may be able to weigh in on this. Have you looked at the 68 election statistically?
Kind of brushed the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be an interesting conversation, because I've read articles about it, and it's very possible he would have won. It looked like he was going to win the primaries to come, but the way that the election run, it would have been close.
Yeah, once LBJ dropped out and it was all wide open,
It was-
Kennedy gets in, and it's pretty much, in my opinion, probably his take.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. There's some that argue otherwise. Anyway, so a Bobby Kennedy presidency is pretty scary. If you believe that John Kennedy was killed by the state. And he was. I have another zine that talks about that. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. So, given that that's the case, do you want Bobby in the White House in 1968? And also, one other thing you have to think about too is, would Bobby Kennedy have stayed in Vietnam? Right? Because Nixon went there and then went to Cambodia and was incredibly profitable for a number of companies. I wish Tim had showed up because he has some interesting things on that. But anyway, so let's get to Bobby Kennedy. Very famously, Bobby was at the Ambassador Hotel. This is 2 months after King. This is in June 1968. And he won the California primary. And he's at the hotel. He goes downstairs, and he's going through the kitchen. And in the kitchen, there's an incident. And Sirhan supposedly shoots Bobby Kennedy. Okay. Can I borrow it? Cool. Okay. And it's actually in the drawing here, too. So
am I going to shake hands?
Wait, shake hands.
Carl Euchre, the
with the maitre d', yeah, Carl Euchre was standing right here. So let's say you're Bobby Kennedy, okay? Sirhan was no closer than 1.5 feet, but most of the witnesses put him somewhere between 3 and 6 feet. I think there's one witness that says he was 8 feet, but somewhere in this distance, okay? And Sirhan's shooting like this, and he gets off. Well, according to Carl Euchre, he gets off one shot, and then Euchre grabbed a hold of his wrist and started banging it on the table. Okay. But he did shoot 8 times. He emptied the revolver that he was shooting. Okay. So, if Sirhan's right here, and Bobby Kennedy's right there, where did Bobby Kennedy get shot?
should be all over.
Right? Okay. The kill shot is right here. All 100% of the bullets are going the other way. There's one that goes through his coat. He's wearing a coat that didn't hit him. There's another one that goes up here, and then there's one that is at the very base of the skull, pressed up against the skull. Thank you, sir. appreciate you. Okay? So, I kind of rest my case at this point, right? There's a lot of witnesses in this kitchen. A lot of witnesses. And witnesses got shot. Paul Schrade got shot in the head. He's another. I got to meet Paul Schrade. He's really another very interesting person. So it is not possible. It is 100% impossible that Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy. And there's been attempts to show, well, maybe Bobby, was doing this, and then, but the gun's right there. And this is the coroner, Dr. Noguchi, the Los Angeles coroner, said that the gun was pressed right against his temple. Well, so then that begs the question, was there anybody behind Bobby Kennedy with a gun? Yeah, there was. His name was Thane Eugene Caesar. He was a security guard, and he admitted to pulling out his revolver. He also was a John Bircher. If you know anything about the John Birch Society, it's a radical right-wing, just short of Nazi group. Yes, exactly. And he also worked for Hughes Aviation, which is, I wish I could pursue that sideline right now, but I can't. He's a very suspicious character. And he is really, unless there was somebody else we don't know about, he's really the only person who physically could have shot Bobby.
Could it have been an accident?
8 times?
I don't know. It's possible. I don't think so. He says that he drew his gun, but he did not fire. And the witnesses have different accounts of what happened. The one thing we do know, though, is that there were 8 shots at Sirhan's gun, but there were 10 bullets that were fired in the pantry. Which then became a big mess because the LAPD came and started removing tiles from the roof because it had bullet holes in it. And basically, I probably shouldn't say this because I like going to LA, but if the LAPD are investigating something, anyway, I'm not going to go there. But yeah, it is impossible. Sirhan could not have killed him, period. In addition to which, Sirhan appears to have been a mind control subject. He displayed automatic writing. He would write, RFK must die, RFK must die, RFK must die. He was hypnotized several times during the course of the trial with some crazy results. And I'm not going to go too much into mind control right now, even though if you want to know more, that's actually all on my zine, because I do talk about the history of mind control a little bit. But with this case, I like to just go back to the physical facts, because there's a lot of weird stuff in the RFK investigation. But it's in many ways it's the simplest one, because the guy who was supposed to have killed him couldn't have done it. And if that's the case, if the police investigated this murder and they had this evidence, right? They know that Sirhan's in front of them. They know that Bobby shot in the back of the head. Why didn't they investigate anything else? Why did they decide that Sirhan has to be the guy? Why would they do that? And I don't know the answer, but it begs an answer. Why would that happen? Okay. Knowing also that Bobby Kennedy was potentially political dynamite, that he could have changed the course of the country. And in a book called Brothers by David Talbot, he shows that Bobby did not believe that Oswald had killed his brother. The first call that he made after he found out about the assassination was to John McCone, the head of the CIA. And he said, "Did you guys have anything to do with this?" And John McCone said no. And they were both Catholics. So the story is that Bobby asked him, as a Catholic, "Did you guys have anything to do with this?" And he said no. Who knows? But Bobby did not believe that story. And in fact, he assigned somebody to go investigate the case. And so there was some thought that Bobby would reopen the JFK murder if he had become president. In addition to the fact that, I mean, the difference between Bobby Kennedy and Richard Nixon politically, you know, we thought Richard Nixon was the worst. Now we have Trump, so, you know, maybe not. But there's a divide there. And I just wanted to mention this kind of in passing. One of the, I've more or less written a book on this. I haven't published it yet. About films that have certain connections to things. The Parallax View is one of the most interesting movies ever made, and it has a setup at the very beginning that is quite similar to the Bobby Kennedy assassination, and the parallels are very easy to see. And this is one of those classic, quote-unquote, political conspiracy thrillers, directed by a guy named Alan Pakula, who made a lot of great pictures. And anyway, very, very interesting movie. And it has a sequence in the middle that shows what the mind control process would look like to Warren Beatty in this movie. That is one of the most extraordinary things you'll ever see. It's amazing. Anyway, just a quick hit on that. And these are books that I found useful in researching the Kennedy case. The late Bill Turner and John Christian wrote kind of the classic, The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, in the late 70s. More recently, my friend Shane O'Sullivan put out a book called Who Killed Bobby, which is really good. And has a bunch of stuff that I didn't even mention, the girl with the polka dot dress, or some of the other witnesses. It was extraordinary stuff. And those are things that I would recommend. There's also a film called The Second Gun that was made in the 70s. And you could probably find it on, I was able to find it on YouTube a few years ago. I'm sure it's still there. Very interesting documentary. It has interviews with Gene Caesar, has interviews with Carl Euchre, the maitre d', several people involved in the case. It's a little cheesy, I guess. It has 70s production values, but the information is amazing. It's terrific. So. And I just wanted to mention in passing too that 1968 was a nightmare, and it was after the death of John Kennedy, it's like you have this movement to undo the promise of the left. I mean, the idea that people would work together cooperatively, that we could end racism, that we could end sexism, that we could change the way society looks. And I think it's instructive to note that the people who were assassinated were all on the other side of that. We got Malcolm, we got King, we've got Bobby Kennedy. But we also have a lot of Black Panthers that got killed. And in fact, the gentleman who founded the Black Panther Party, Bobby Seale, I interviewed him a few years ago, and he said that the reason he started the Black Panther Party was because of Martin Luther King. And he was an engineer. He was an engineer on the Gemini program. This is a brilliant dude. And he went and saw Martin Luther King speak, and he decided, I got to be an organizer now, because I got to get part of this. That was the kind of impact that King was having. And then later Bobby. And this is Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was killed in December of 1969. He's one of my heroes. He became the chairman of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers when he was 18 years old. And he was murdered by the police when he was 21. And I call this the murder without the conspiracy because basically the police didn't bother. They had a guy on the inside who drugged him, and then they showed up at 3 a.m. and executed him in the back of the head while he was sleeping. And they shot a bunch of other people too. They killed Mark Clark as well. Many of the arrests and shootings of Black Panther individuals are shocking and resemble some of the things that happen now, like the gentleman from Sacramento who is in his backyard on the phone and gets murdered by the police. how this is still happening in 2018. I don't know, but it is. And I think it has to do with power. And I think that power changed in the 60s. There was this movement to come away from it, and that change has just been going through for the last 50 years. And as we lose more and more of our rights, corporations get more and more power, and everything gets funneled to the 1%. And Donald Trump seems to be the culmination of this. I couldn't figure out either why Donald Trump got elected. I said, what the hell is this guy going to do? But in some ways, he's sort of useful, because he's so outrageous that he can do anything. You know, he just nominated somebody who said she couldn't go on record whether she supported Brown versus Board of Education. Like, you know, this is nuts. And he's the only one that could get away with it in a certain sense. He's so beyond the pale that he can do all this stuff. And I feel like what's coming next is going to be some sort of reformer. But what happens is that Donald Trump takes everything to 10. Somebody comes in to reform, takes it back to 8. But we've already lost all of this ground in the middle, and this has been happening since the 60s, in my view. So, these are some books that I can highly recommend that I did not write. It's not pictured on here because I've got it here. This is the book that we published. It's John Judge. He's a brilliant guy. And in some ways, I sort of see myself as, he's like an extra dad for me. And Mae Brussell is the mom that I never knew. Like, I got extra parents. Because my thinking is so, was changed after John Judge and Mae Brussell. Mae Brussell was a researcher in the 60s and 70s. She died in the early 80s. And she was just an absolute genius. And I could do a whole hour just talking about her. But this is a great book, Investigations of Fascism in America. It's put out by Feral House. Very good book. On the right there is Drugs as Weapons Against Us. It's by my buddy John Potash. It's a great book. It goes into more detail on more assassinations, but it also has a lot of interesting information about the history of mind control if you're interested in that. Anyway, terrific book. John's a great guy. He's a guy who got a master's degree in journalism from Columbia and then worked at a halfway house in Baltimore to getting heroin addicts off. We walks the walk. And then the gentleman over here, Trumpocalypse Now, is written by a friend of mine named Ken Thomas. Ken Thomas is kind of a legend in our circles, and he very kindly asked me to do the afterwork for that book. And he wrote it last year, and it has more or less described exactly what we got. Ken Thomas has analyzed exactly what Trump was going to do and why he was going to do it. It's a fairly slim book, and it's brilliant. And it will inform your perspective as far as where Trump comes from and who he serves. So that was the last thing. And then one more thing I did want to do a quick plug since I'm here. The next book that Say Something Real is putting out is called The Deep State in the Heart of Texas. It's by my friend Richard Bartholomew. He's been very patient with me because I've been editing this thing for a long time. And it should be coming out very soon. Also has a foreword by Ed Tatro. If you know JFK research, you'll know who that is. This book is it's brilliant. It's also a piece of Texana, in addition to being a really, really interesting book about the Texas connections to what happened in Dealey Plaza. Anyway, great stuff. And that's all I got. That is my presentation. I can take questions if you got them, and talk about other stuff. But that's what I got.
All these years, I never knew that about James Owen.
Yeah, most people don't really, they're not familiar with the details of things. They know kind of, oh, this happened. But, you know, Alan Dulles said that the
bathtub, you know.
Yeah, all the...
I never knew that.
And the devil's in the details. And that's the problem. You've got to go and look. And people are very resistant to this information. Like, I don't know. And I was the same way when I started, and then you have no choice, because it's like, the information's there. So, what are you going to do? And I grew up, it's my mom speaking, by the way. I grew up in Laredo on the campus of a university where my dad was a professor. And so I had access to like as many books as I wanted. It was, all you can eat. And I studied philosophy as a kid. And this is probably, I would recommend this to anybody because what happens is you can break down your internal resistance to ideas. If you, listen, you can, it's not that hard. Once you've read Descartes, who takes you back to the foundational, I think therefore I am. Once you've read that and you can do that and you can break yourself down, you can do that with anything else. And it takes away some of the effects of propaganda, I think. I mentioned Time Life before. There was an article that was written by Carl Bernstein. Carl Bernstein was one of the guys involved in the Watergate investigation. It was written for Rolling Stone in 1977, and it identified several hundred journalists that were on the take of the CIA. And Henry Luce, the publisher of Time Life, was one of them. Yeah, of course. And once you sort of break through that barrier, that the information is being presented to you, and I hate this term fake news, okay? Fake news is a useless term. Because you can't do that. You have to analyze everything. You always have to consider the source of the information, where it's coming from, all that sort of stuff. But it's not a knee-jerk thing. It's subtle. It's not just, oh, well, that's obviously fake news. But having said that, when you're getting the one interesting thing that I didn't mention that is relevant to what I'm saying now, there is an FBI document where Hoover and this other guy from the FBI, I don't know if it was William Stahl, I don't remember, but Hoover's talking to this other person about what they should do about the MLK case, the James Earl Ray case. And Hoover says we should get somebody to write up our side of this, somebody who we like and that likes us, maybe Reader's Digest, or maybe Gerald Frank. Gerald Frank did write the book the FBI wanted him to write. And it is the FBI's version of James Earl Ray definitely killed Martin Luther King. Once you see that sort of thing going on, it's like, geez. Yeah. Anyway. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I really appreciate it. And